when I was at the gaming squad, you know, we used to watch Freeman go around the casinos, following around the casinos overnight, and he was collecting money, putting it in his boot. He used to drive at incredible speeds, and we used to say to ourselves, you know, we'd be better off locking him up for driving in a speed dangerous to the public, because at least we'll get a result, rather than try and bash our heads up against a brick wall and have him arrested for his involvement in organised crime. And I remember one particular night, we were tapping Stan Smith's telephone. We had Freeman's phone off, we had Lennie McPherson's phone off, and we had Stan Smith's phone off. And Smith, they were talking about getting, these were in the days when people like George Walker, Perce Galea and Bruce Galea were running illegal casinos in Sydney, but they were all independent of one another. Like Walker had the Goulburn Club in 33 Goulburn Street. Galea had the Forbes Club. There was the Palace, which someone else operated, and there was a number of big illegal games going on, but they weren't part of any organisation. So Smith, McPherson and Freeman, and McPherson was sort of, he was known as a bit of an enforcer, a collector, standover man, and they used to use him to collect debts and things like that, and he was a big guy, a big heavy-set thug, one of the old-time crooks, generally very reliable. And I remember a story when I arrested a guy called Reg Andrews, who had a casino years ago at King's Cross, and he told me about when he first recruited McPherson to drive him home overnight, because he used to take large amounts of money home. And he took McPherson down to the Menangle Trots one day, because they had a couple of trotters that they had put a fair bit of money on. And he said Lennie didn't know anything about racing in those days. He said, and when they got there, he said, what do you want to do, Len? And he said, I'll just go for a walk. And he said, why do you blokes do your business? And when they got in the car at the end of the day, Lennie said to them, how'd you go? And they said, we lost our money. The horse that we put all the money on got beat. And McPherson said, you should have told me. He said, I could have got over the other side of the course and shot the horse that looked like winning. He said, and then you would have won your money. But that's the sort of guy Lennie was. He was a real character, and I got to know him well when he was a registered informant of mine at the National Crime Authority. A fascinating guy. Obviously been involved in a whole host of things throughout his life, and when he was in jail, I actually gave him an opportunity to come forward and in a closed hearing and disclose his involvement and his knowledge of unsolved crimes in return for protection by the federal government. And he thought about it. At the end of the day, he refused it, and he died in jail. So that was Lennie's decision.
Wow.
Yeah, that was pretty heavy stuff. And but getting back to Freeman, Smith and McPherson, and this was Smith's idea. Smith was an absolute organiser. It was his idea to put together this scheme whereby they would unite all the illegal games. Each of them would have to pay a given amount for protection each week, and that money would go to the police and the politicians. And they talked about it freely over the telephone. And even to the point where Smith visited these places, and he knew how many clients they had, what nights they were operating, how much money they were taking, so that when they approached them, they couldn't turn around and say, hang on, we can't afford that sort of money. So when they approached these people, they more or less said, okay. There was a guy called Mick Kirby out at Sutherland that had a game at Waratah Street, and they contacted him on the telephone and said, we want $2,500 off you each week. And he said, I'm not even making that much each week. And they said, yes, you are. We know how much you're making a week, and $2,500 is only a small proportion of what your take is. And he said, look, I'll just close the place down and go back to what I was doing before, which was SP betting. They said, if you close the place down, you go back to nothing. You won't operate. So eventually he agreed to pay the $2,500 a week. But they met all these illegal operators at the old Four Seas restaurant in Elizabeth Street, Sydney, which was a Chinese restaurant, and it was a meeting place for a lot of crooks in those days. They'd sit there over a meal and talk about their crime and everything else. Now, Stan Smith prepared a tape, and he wanted Freeman, who was going to the meeting. Freeman didn't want Stan to go with him because Stan used to get a bit carried away. He got really excited. But Stan prepared this tape, and he wanted George to play it to these operators if they didn't go along with it. And I remember, God, I wish I still had that tape. But I remember one of the things he said in it, and it was virtually addressing all these casino operators and saying, you people are only prepared to pay pennies when many, many pounds are involved. And you're talking about coppers that you got sweet, which means that you've got a copper who's prepared to take money, and you're talking about politicians, and that's hard cash. So what he's saying to them is you've got to pay big if you want this protection. And George actually met all these casino operators at the Four Seas restaurant. We waited for him to leave the meeting. He had a meeting with Stan Smith just on the other side of Elizabeth Street, and more or less we assume, he told Stan everything went well, they've all agreed to it, we've got everything in place. And as Stan walked away from that meeting to go back to his car, Freeman had handed him the tape back and told him he didn't need to use the tape. Stan pulled all the tape out of the actual cassette. He couldn't rip it. He ripped some of it, but it's hard to rip recording tape. He ripped some of it, but most of it just pulled out of the cassette and he dumped it in the garbage bin. Well, we retrieved it and put it back together, and that's how we had the tape. So it was a great insight into how these people's minds operated and what they were trying to do at that particular point in time. But the great problem for us was that we still had a corrupt commissioner in the police, and we had no one to go to. And it was that sort of frustration which led to the leaking of the age tapes to try and get something done about it, because nothing was ever going to happen from within policing whilst you had people in charge that were protecting these individuals.